Hi boys and girls, it's Mrs. Horan. I'm here to read you a story, and I decided to sit on my porch today because it's such a beautiful day out, and also because it's springtime. So happy spring, everybody. And the story I'm going to read to you is a book that is a classic story. That means that it's been around for a really long time and it's still being read over and over again. It was around when I was a little girl and definitely when your grown-ups were young and were your age. And it takes place in the springtime. The name of the story is called Make Way for Ducklings. And it's a fiction story about a family of ducks. And first there's a mommy and a daddy duck, and they're trying to find a place to lay their eggs. And then after their eggs hatch and they have their ducklings, they're trying to find a place to live. The neat part of the story is that it takes place in Boston, which is a real place, which you may have been to with your families, but it's not that far from here where we live in Marion. And it takes place in a special park that's in Boston called the Boston Common. The thing you'll notice in the story is that the pictures are, they're not colored, they're black and white, so they're like sketches. But when you look at like the cars in the story and some of the background pictures, this story takes place a long time ago, so you're gonna notice it looks a little older. But anyway, I hope you enjoy the story. It's a little longer, so get comfortable and think about your whole body listening skills. You can really show your grown-ups what that's all about. So listening ears on, calm hands, eyes looking at the story, brain thinking about the story, heart feeling the story. Okay, here we go. Make Way for Ducklings. And this is a story that was written and illustrated by Robert McCloskey. Make Way for Ducklings. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live, but every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There were sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles, so they flew on and on. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. The very place to spend the night, quacked Mr. Mallard. So down they flapped. Next morning, they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find much. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer, but the people on the boat threw peanuts in the water. So the Mallards followed them all around the pond and got another breakfast, better than the first. The name of this boat that you'll notice is called a swan boat. And there are still swan boats that are in the pond in the Boston Common. Maybe you've been on one before. Maybe someday you'll go on one. "I like this place," said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed out on the bank and waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard, delighted that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. But "Look out!" squawked Mrs. Mallard, all of a dither. "You'll get run over." And when she got her breath, she added, "This is no place for babies, with all those horrid things rushing about. We'll have to look somewhere else." So she's changed her mind because there are lots of things happening, like a bicycle rider going by. So they flew over Beacon Hill and round the State House, but there was no place there. They looked in Lewisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. Then they flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mr. Mallard. "That island looks like a nice, quiet place, and it's only a little way from the public garden." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. "That looks like just the right place to hatch ducklings." The Mallards really like peanuts. Do you like peanuts? I do. So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest. And only just in time for now, they were beginning to molt. All their old wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. That word is molt, when their feathers change. But of course they could swim, and one day they swam over to the park on the riverbank, and there they met a policeman called Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that the Mallards called on Michael every day. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't go to visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs to keep them warm. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water or to have her lunch or to count the eggs and make sure they were all there. Do you remember how many eggs she said she had? That's right, 8 eggs. One day, the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, connection, then Cack, then Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility, taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. Their names rhyme. They all sound the same at the end. One day, Mr. Mallard decided he'd like to take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further on. So off he set. "I'll meet you in a week in the public garden," he quacked over his shoulder. "Take good care of the ducklings." "Don't you worry," said Mrs. Mallard. "I know all about bringing up children." And she did. She taught them how to swim and dive. She taught them to walk in a line, to come when they were called, and to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." Before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack fell into line, just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. They're just right in line, just like we line up in the hallway to go to different places. The ducks are in line, one behind the other, eyes forward. There they waded ashore and waddled along until they came to the highway. Uh-oh. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. Honk, honk, went the horns on the speeding cars. Quack, went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. Quack, 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 went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on, quack, quack, quacking. And they're saying, quack, quack, quack. They want those cars to let them go. Boy, that must be scary for them. They made such a noise that Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. Tweet, tweet, as the whistle blew. He planted himself on the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the traffic, and then beckoned with the other, the way policemen do, so that Mrs. Mallard and her ducklings could cross. He's a good friend to them. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to his booth. He called Clancy at headquarters and said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street." Clancy said, "Family of what? Ducks?" yelled Michael. "Send a police car, quick." Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned into Charles Street with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack all marching in line behind her. Look how cute they look. They're good listeners for their mommy. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Isn't it amazing?" And a man who swept the street said, "Well, now ain't that nice?" And when Mrs. Mallard heard them, she was so proud, she tipped her nose in the air and walked with a little extra swing in her waddle. When they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was the police car with 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The policemen held back the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings could march across the street. Right onto the public garden. Which is back to the park where that swan boat was. Inside the gate, they all turned around to say thank you to the policeman. The policeman said goodbye and they waved. When they reached the pond and swam across to the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he had promised. The ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there. All day long, they follow the swan boats and they eat the peanuts. And when night falls, they swim to their little island and go to sleep. And that's the end of Make Way for Ducklings. I hope that you enjoyed this story. One thing you can do is think about telling the story in your own words to your grown-ups. You can try to remember it. I know if it was the first time you heard it, it might be a little hard to tell it in your own words, but you always want to think about the beginning of the story, the middle, and the end. Okay, bye boys and girls. Have a wonderful day. I hope you get some fresh air and play outside. It's very sunny and bright and beautiful today. I'll see you soon. Bye.